Joining us for our second hour, Bruce Pardy, a professor in the Faculty of Law at Queen's University, and from the Justice Center for Constitutional Freedoms, Jay Cameron, who is a barrister and solicitor, and from the Quebec Women's Rights Association, Michelle Sirois, who's the president of the group, Diane Guilbeault, the vice president, and Lynn Jubenville, the treasurer and webmaster. I hope I've pronounced those names correctly. Witnesses, you all have, spokespersons have up to 5 minutes for an opening presentation, and I believe we will begin with Ms. Sirois. The floor is yours, madam.
Honorable Sénatrice.
Honorable Senators, thank you for having invited me to testify on Bill C-16. As citizens and feminists, we are convinced that we need to fight against discrimination. But Bill C-16 does not improve the protection of transgendered people. Rather, C-16 will eliminate or weaken women's rights, which is unacceptable in a society that has formally committed to defending them. That's why we are asking for a comparative analysis, a gender-based analysis, before the bill is passed. First, let's define the words gender and sex. This bill talks about gender identity, and so this is a very essential distinction. Sex refers to biological characteristics that differentiate men and women, as Status of Women Canada and all of the other organizations that work in gender equality have stated. All of these organizations say there are two sexes. Gender refers to so-called feminine and masculine attributes, which are defined by social discourse, culture, and history. So this is a social construct. And this is what we're talking about when we're talking about gender stereotypes. So based on these definitions, we can wonder how it is that people ever came to think that changing gender means changing sex. This is impossible. Now, how does Bill C-16 threaten the rights that women have acquired over the last 50 years? Well, here are a few examples. First, sports. In March 2017, a weightlifter won the Women's International Championship for weightlifting, winning a gold medal at Rio. Up until the previous year, he had been competing with men, but then he presented himself as transgender and was allowed to compete against women. The ICO's new standards were adopted very discreetly in 2016, and they allow men who claim to be transgender to compete against female athletes if their testosterone level does not surpass 10 nanomoles per liter. In other words, 4 times more than the average for women. Of course, they also have more muscle mass, which gives them an advantage over women. Does this mean that from now on, the acceptable testosterone level for women would be tripled, with all of the incentives to doping that would entail? The growing participation of transgender men in feminine sports threatens the hopes of women and girls hoping to win sports competitions. So women have many reasons to challenge the arrival of male athletes in their competitions. With Bill C-16, it would be difficult to do so because women's teams could be prosecuted for doing so. Women fought for decades to be able to participate in the games, and now this is the situation. Second example, prisons. Everyone remembers Colonel Russell Williams, who was found guilty of 82 accusations, including 2 murders of women and sexual assault. Colonel Williams liked to take pictures of himself in his victims' underwear. Why would he not be in a women's prison? Now, the British Association for Gender Identity warned the government that they would have to be very careful about transfers based on gender identity, because there was a growing number of sexual predators who were claiming to have a different gender identity, whether that was proven or not, so that they could be transferred into women's prisons. If there's no framework to rein in this freedom of gender identity, then why would the authorities not be able to authorize such a transfer? Again, C-16 doesn't help here. Third example, children. Bill 16 would make gender identity changes completely banal. It provides no definition, and it leaves the door open to all sorts of abuses. There has been an explosion in requests for gender changes from children who don't conform to gender stereotypes. For example, boys who like wearing princess dresses, or teenage girls who feel uncomfortable with their breasts. Studies are clear. Over 80% of children who have gender dysphoria become adults who are very comfortable with their bodies. There's a lot of underlying homophobia in this desire to treat children who are possibly gay but who say that they're born into the wrong body. Mutilations like mastectomies on teenagers or the administration of puberty blockers or the lifetime taking of... Just a minute. Okay. Sterilization. How can any of this be in the best interest of children? Thank you.
We will now move to Mr. Cameron. Sir.
Honorable Senators, thank you for the opportunity to address this committee. We live in a free society that places a high value on personal autonomy and individual rights. In the context of free speech for all, I will illustrate what this means. In a free society, if I wish, and my grades are good enough, I may go to medical school and I can earn the prestigious title of doctor. But I cannot compel people to refer to me as doctor, and neither can the government. This is so despite the fact that I may strongly identify as a doctor. It might even be the driving force behind my identity. I can be a teacher at a university and be called professor, but I cannot be charged under human rights or criminal legislation if I refuse to call someone a professor, even if she is one. I can be a pastor or a priest or a rabbi and minister to my communities for 50 years, and yet I cannot compel society to address me as reverend or father or rabbi, and neither can the government. Her Royal Majesty may make me a knight, but I cannot be charged under human rights or criminal legislation for refusing to call a knight sir. In a free society, I am free to refer to myself as anything I want. I can refer to myself as a man or a woman or anything in between or something new entirely. But I cannot compel someone to refer to me as such or make them use my chosen identifier or pronoun, and neither can the government. The bill before you, Bill C-16, is a vague and defective piece of legislation because it lacks certainty. Its uncertainty allows for it to be interpreted as compelling the speech of Canadians, such as the forced use of gender-neutral pronouns. It is unprecedented to have human rights or criminal legislation require speech of its citizens. Prohibit speech, perhaps, in limited circumstances, but require it never, not in the civil context. It is contrary to the jurisprudence to have the power of the state compel the tongue of the citizen. The Supreme Court of Canada stated in National Bank of Canada versus Retail Clerks International Union, anything that forces someone to express opinions that are not their own is a penalty that is totalitarian, and as such alien to the tradition of free nations like Canada, even for the repression of the most serious crimes. Chief Justice McLaughlin in R versus Sharp made it clear that the fundamental freedom of expression possessed by Canadians makes possible our liberty, our creativity, our democracy. It does this by protecting not only good and popular expression, but also unpopular and even offensive expression. And I would note that offensive is a subjective thing. What one finds offensive, another may not find offensive. And to a certain extent, I must choose to be offended by what I hear. Not everyone appreciates freedom of expression as they should. There can be little doubt that the Canadian Human Rights Commission, based on existing human rights jurisprudence, will compel service providers, employers, and employees to refer to transgender people by their self-chosen pronoun with legal consequences for those who refuse to use such language. This is already occurring and it should concern you. The Ontario Human Rights Commission explained that refusing to refer to a trans person by their chosen name and a personal pronoun that matches their gender identity or purposefully misgendering will likely be discrimination when it takes place in a social area covered by the code, including employment, housing, and services like education. Even supporters of Bill C-16, such as University of Toronto law professor Brenda Kosman, admits that pronoun misuse can constitute a violation of human rights legislation. By not using someone's preferred pronoun, one could be subjected to fines, damages, termination of employment, ideological re-education in the form of sensitivity training, and other so-called remedies. The fact is that if C-16 is passed, it will result in the government forcing people to say and not say certain things under the threat of penalty. Honorable Senators, I ask you to think carefully about what kind of a nation you want to create today. Shall we have a Canada where the halls are full of tattletales over pronouns and the easily offended make still greater attempts to use the power of a supposedly neutral state to advance their own agenda? At what point does reason intrude in this conversation? At what point do the principles of a free society and the right to speak prevent state overreach? Do we really want a Canada where people walk on eggshells, afraid to speak, afraid not to speak? I do not. But I am afraid that you will not hear me for the clamor of those who do not realize what they are asking for. Many support this bill innocent of the repercussions of their own liberty, if it passes. But the fact is this: there are elements who support this bill that are hostile to the freedom that Canadians currently enjoy, not because they love a free society, but because they believe there is too much freedom in society.
Please wrap up.
These persons say it must be curtailed further. Parliament has an obligation to only enact legislation that is constitutional. In my respectful submission, this law in its current form offends the Charter of Rights under Section 2B. You should want to amend the draft legislation.
We're going to have to move on. Professor Party.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thank you for having me. I urge you not to pass Bill C-16 in its present form because of the threat that it poses to freedom of speech. I would like to make 4 points. Number one, forced speech is the most egregious infringement of freedom of speech, and freedom of speech may be the most important freedom that we have. Compelled speech puts words in the mouths of citizens and threatens to punish them if they do not comply. When speech is merely restricted, you can at least keep your thoughts to yourself. Forced speech makes people say things with which they do not agree. Number two, and I'm speaking here of the first part of Bill C-16, the part that amends the Human Rights Act. That amendment may well require people to use non-gendered speech against their will. That is a form of forced speech. Now, the amendment, as has been pointed out, does not refer to speech specifically. So how do we know that that is in fact the case? Well, as has been mentioned, you must look to what the Human Rights Commissions say about it, because it is those commissions, both the Canadian version and the provincial versions for their provincial codes, that have the primary task of interpreting and applying those provisions. It is not the courts, first and foremost. It is not the government that controls the meaning. Once the statute is passed, its interpretation and application is largely controlled by the Commission and then also by the tribunal. The courts will provide these bodies with a very high degree of deference, and it will be their call. The statute will mean what the Commission and tribunal say that it means. So, what do these bodies say that it means? You have heard these words before. I'm going to read them again because the point is important. The Ontario Human Rights Commission believes that the equivalent provisions in the Ontario Code mean, or may very likely mean, that people must use pronouns against their will. Refusing to refer to a trans person by their chosen name and a personal pronoun that matches their gender identity, or purposely misgendering, will likely be discrimination. Number three, if the government does not intend for C-16 to force speech, then it would be a simple matter to say so in the bill. It is not complicated. And that indication would foreclose that interpretation by both the Commission and the Tribunal. Number 4, the Honourable Minister of Justice appeared before this committee on May 4. I understood her to state that she did not believe that C-16 would require people to use pronouns against their will, and that it was not the intent of the government to make them do so. My point is this: if that indeed is the case, then putting that intent in the legislation is simple as pie. It has so far declined to do so, and if that in fact is their intent, I cannot understand that reluctance. And I think I'll leave it there, Mr. Chair.
All right, thank you. We'll move to questions beginning with Senator Platt.
Thank you very much, Chair, and thank you to all our witnesses. A couple of questions. Professor Party, you really started very clearly talking about the issue that I wanted to question you on, but I will pose the question in any event. You said here, and you mentioned in your written submission, that if the government does not intend for C-16 to force speech, it could easily make its intent clear, and you've confirmed that here. Why do you, and you are absolutely right with what you said you heard the minister say. I heard the minister say the same thing. I was sitting beside her. Why do you believe the government has not included this intent, if that is their intent? And in your opinion, what could the government have done to make Parliament's intention clear for future interpretation of this legislation? And maybe what can we do? Because there are those here that are continually saying that it does not compel speech, and then there are those like yourself and others, and I believe that it does, and yet what could we do to make that explicitly clear that it would not compel speech? And then, Chair, I have one question for Mr. Cameron.
Thank you for the question. I have included in my written submission a very simple proposed amendment that would in fact put that government intent in place. It does not interfere in any way with the rest of the bill. It simply indicates that the bill is not intended to mean that the use of male and female pronouns to refer to any person would constitute a discriminatory practice. Now, there probably are various ways to word that kind of amendment, but the point is that the amendment is very simple. It's not legally difficult to do. As to the other question about why the government has declined to do so, I'm not the government, so I could only speculate. Perhaps they would like to leave this question in the hands of the Commission and the Tribunal and have not actually determined which outcome they prefer, or perhaps they prefer the outcome that it looks like the Commission and Tribunal would come to. But that is pure speculation on my part. I really cannot understand why, given the intent that the Minister suggested, why that simple step would not be taken.
Well, we all like to speculate on why the government does certain things, so we will continue. Mr. Cameron, we have constitutional experts, even right here at this table, maybe not on this side of the table, but certainly on the other, with people like Senator Joyelle and Senator Baker, who isn't here right now, but that are arguing in favor of this bill, and others are. And yet you've used the Supreme Court. I will just read one passage here, ruling that the Supreme Court made in National Bank of Canada versus Retail Clerks International Union, and it goes like this. Anything that forces someone to express opinions that are not their own is a penalty that is totalitarian and as such alien to the tradition of free nations like Canada, even for the repression of the most serious crimes. Given that ruling by the Supreme Court, and again, you talked about the constitutionality, why do you believe this is not constitutional when other constitutional experts say right in the face of that, well, that doesn't really matter, it's still constitutional?
Thank you for the question, Honourable Senator. There's two reasons, really, I would say. The first is that the evidence that we're having around this this gathering right now, and as there have been other panels as well who have been here, the fact that we're debating whether or not it would compel speech or it wouldn't, and there are so many people who view it as being compulsory of unwanted speech, shows that there is a problem with the legislation. And criminal legislation can be struck down because it is vague, or because it is uncertain, or because it overreaches. And in my respectful submission, this legislation does all of those things. The second reason is that in the history of Canada, as far as I'm aware, there has never been a circumstance where the government passes a law to require the citizen to speak in a certain way. That is a gross state overreach, and it offends Section 2B of the Charter on its face. And this body has an obligation to pass only constitutional laws, and if you don't, the courts will fix it for you. So you should want to fix it here and now.
If there is a second round, Chair, I have a question for the ladies at the
Thank
table.
you, Senator Pratt.
Thank you, Chair. I don't think the courts will find anything, because they won't find anything in the law that imposes any pronoun or any noun. But anyways, I don't think it's a matter of compelled speech. I think it's, again, a matter of pure respect. I mean, in a civilized society, there are simply things that you cannot say. And laws protect people against discriminatory language or hateful language. Some people may think that blacks should not be referred by their name, that they should all be called hey nigger, but you don't call them hey nigger, you call them by their name, because this is things that you do. So this same kind of things would apply to transgender people. You don't call them by a name that they don't think they should be called them. You call them by the name that they choose, and that by the pronoun that they choose, because this is the respectful thing to do, isn't it?
You want to take that first?
Oh, sorry, were you addressing that question to me, sir?
To you or to Mr.
You
Pardy?
go first.
I'm happy to address the question, sir. Thank you very much. In our society, which is a free and just society, we do not compel respect. It is not the government's role to compel us to respect each other. And there is no case law which says that I must respect any person or that they must respect me. I'm a lawyer. I don't require people to speak to me as Esquire or Mr. Cameron or barrister and solicitor. And if they refuse to address me as such, I would have no legal recourse against them. Neither does a doctor, neither does a professor, neither does a knight, neither does a senator.
Just 2 quick points. The first one is that the question about compelled speech is not whether or not the speech that's being compelled is reasonable speech. Any speech that is compelled is by definition unreasonable. If you had a statute, for example, that compelled people to say hello and please and thank you, all of which are perfectly reasonable things to say, the statute would be totalitarian, because it puts words in the mouths of citizens. In a free country, people decide for themselves what to say. And as soon as you take that right away from them, you cannot claim any longer to be living in a free society. Second point, you cannot legislate respect. Respect is an emotional and intellectual response to something and somebody. It is earned and develops over time. All you've done is take the force of the state to create the pretense of respect. And that is a sad facsimile.
But you can certainly legislate to prevent lack of respect. And again, with respect, there is nothing in the legislation that mandates pronouns or nouns. There is nothing in the legislation that says that.
I agree that it does not refer to speech, and in fact, I hope that we would agree. It sounds like you interpret the statute as though it does not require speech and should not require speech. I agree with you, and all I'm saying is it does leave open that possibility because of the control the Commission had, and there is an easy way to make sure that your objective and mine are met, and that is to insert a very simple amendment saying what you just said.
Thank you, Chair.
Thank you, Senator Boisvenu.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I'll give the witnesses a moment to put in their earpieces. Can you hear the interpretation? Okay, good. You can hear me. So my question is for you, Mr. Cameron. Several observers state that this bill is very poorly written, poorly defined, particularly when it comes to the lack of definition for the terms gender identity and gender expression. So I have two questions about this. First, could you comment about the risks associated with not having clear definitions for those terms? And second question, which follows from the first, because of this lack of definition, is there then a risk that there will be more accusations made against citizens, more complaints?
Thank you for the question, sir. In response to the first question, there are risks in regard to uncertainty. And one of the problems is with this legislation is that it introduces the thorny subject of gender identity into a realm that is filled with relatively stable and certain categories. The question of gender identity has a level of subjectivity that some of the other categories of the human rights legislation does not have. They are not subjective. For example, if I have a religious belief, it is my belief, and it's personal. But if I am a woman or a man, it is something that is objective. But there is a level of subjectivity that is in disagreement in the scientific community and in the psychological community and in the sociological community in regard to gender identity. People disagree on what it means. This side of the table disagrees, this side of the table disagrees, the whole room disagrees. Because there's disagreement, when you have something that says that there is a prohibition against doing something towards a specific category, because there is uncertainty in regard to this term, there is vagueness, and that leads to risks. And so it can be somebody's perception on one side, somebody in a hallway, or a professor, or an employee, or a boss, or a judge, that what was said is an insult to gender identity. But other people may not see it the same way, and that's because that term remains undefined. And that's a substantial problem, and it renders the legislation unconstitutional.
Et ma deuxième question, c'était, est-ce que le fait de ne pas...
And my other question was, does the fact that there aren't clear definitions lead to the risk that there will be more accusations?
Certainly. And different people who support this legislation have different agendas. Some people want this because they feel that without it, the trans community will not be treated fairly. Some people think that there is too much freedom of speech to be disrespectful in society, and so we need to curtail the level of freedom in people's speech. But irrespective, because of the uncertainty, accusations in regard to what or is not an insult or inciting hatred towards gender identity will absolutely increase because people's perception of what it is or may not be. And then you have unfortunate people hauled in front of tribunals and courts to answer for something that is innocuous and is in accordance with their right as Canadians for free speech under Section 2B anyways. So it will create confusion, which is undesirable.
Okay. Senator Ahmedvar.
Thank you. Thank you, Chair. Professor Pardee, I note with some interest that in January of this year you debated Professor Jordan Peterson, who was our witness just earlier, on the compelled use of pronouns and C-16, and you debated in favor of C-16. I wonder if you can recall your arguments in favor of C-16 and compelled pronouns.
Certainly, but I should give some context to that debate. It occurred in the following way. Dr. Peterson was coming in to do the debate, and on my faculty, the hosts of the debate went around to all the various faculty who were of a different opinion than Dr. Peterson to invite them to debate him, and they declined. And so they came to me, even though they knew I agreed with him, and asked me to play devil's advocate, which I did do. One of my arguments was that I said that, look, there's no such thing as free speech. We have restrictions all over the place. We have defamation, we have negligence, we have counseling crimes. To say that there is freedom of speech is disingenuous. And of course, that argument is not correct. We do have freedom of speech, and those infringements are exceptions. And all those exceptions are restrictions on speech. And this infringement of freedom of speech is categorically different because it, as I said before, puts words in the mouths of citizens, which those other restrictions do not do. In order to avoid liability and defamation, all you have to do is keep your opinions to yourself. I'm not endorsing those other instances of freedom of infringement of freedom of speech, but I am saying that they are less severe than the one that we were talking about today.
Okay.
See the transcript.
Senator McDonald.
Thank you, Chair. I have a question for you, Mr. Pardy, if you don't mind. A lot of discussions surrounding this bill. We keep hearing that it's subjective, personal, identity-based. People say that religion is personal and subjective and identity-based, so what's the big deal? So I'm just asking you, how do you respond to that?
I'll respond this way. I think those two kinds of interests are given different status. If you have the freedom of religion, then it gives you the freedom to determine your own beliefs.
Yes.
And that's appropriate.
Yes.
Trans people and non-gendered people should also have the freedom to determine how they want to portray themselves to the world.
Yes.
Those are the equivalents. But here is the one thing that people who claim freedom of religion do not have. They do not have the right to demand that other people agree. The freedom of religion is only the freedom not to be interfered with. And I would be the first one to suggest that trans people and non-gendered people have the freedom to do the same. They have the freedom to decide for themselves how to portray themselves in the world. But the rest of us also have the freedom to come to our own opinions about things, including religion and including transgendered matters. We have, in a free country, all of us have the freedom to come to our own conclusions. And I think that is the distinction between the two grounds that you spoke of.
Thank you. You make the distinction very well. Thank you.
Senator Joel.
My colleague, Senator Platt, has invited me to join the debate, and I will accept that invitation, Senator. Thank you. As you know, the Charter contains a list of rights, and the Supreme Court has clearly recognized that there is no one right superior to the other. They are all rights that exist simultaneously in anyone's person capacity to intervene in public debates. For instance, in the case that you raised, that it would be an infringement on Section 2B, which is, freedom of thought, freedom of discussion, freedom of debate, would be in conflict with Section 15 to the Equality Clause, to the benefit of the law. And of course, all those rights, whatever they are subjected to reasonable limits in a free and democratic society. And the court has established clearly the test, to impose, to conclude if the democratic society or reasonableness is met with a limit. So if you are so, if you hold the conclusion very strongly that this bill is an infringement on the Charter, instead of building into it an exception, why should we not consider to refer the bill to the court so that the Supreme Court would pronounce if this bill is constitutional or not, and it would put an end to the debate, and everybody in Canada would recognize the wisdom of the Supreme Court in relation to the interpretation of the alleged violation of Section 2. It seems to me that there is a way around, the argument that this bill is an infringement, and we would know considering the fact that in almost 10 provinces, I think our colleague Senator Baker has been listing the provinces in which there are provincial legislation of a similar nature, then we would have a law in the land that would be final and everybody would abide by it and adjust to it. So is it not the more, less expensive, more efficient way to address the constitutional doubt that you have with the bill instead of trying to amend it?
Thank you for the question, sir. From my perspective, the contention in regard to this bill is a red flag in regard to the bill. And so the proper thing to do is to address the contention, not necessarily to refer the contention to a court comprised of individuals who will have their own contention, perhaps. You've heard from lots of witnesses why they're concerned about this bill, people who are versed in the criminal law and people who are versed in the charter. So it seems to me to be, if you want to uphold the principles of a free society, the proper thing to do is to put an amendment into the bill to address the concerns which a lot of people have. But of course, it's open to the Senate to refer the bill to the Supreme Court of Canada and obtain a ruling.
Well, we could amend the bill saying, the bill will not be enacted, following pending reference to the Supreme Court. There's a possibility to do that, but of course, it's not the way you have proposed. You prefer that the legislation be amended and then challenged in court, because one day or the other, as we heard from the previous witnesses, that kind of proposal, is susceptible of court challenge.
But it's not even clear what it is you're trying to do. I mean, is the bill intended to force speech or not? People are saying, no, it doesn't do that. If that's what you mean, then say so. If you do mean that, then let's say that. I mean, why would you want the courts to be making the law in the country? You're the legislature. Legislate.
Well, we can legislate as long as we want, but you contend that if we legislate this bill, it would be unconstitutional.
Not if you put in the amendment, sir.
No, but on the basis of what it is now. So in other words, what you tell me is that if this bill is not amended, you would be of the opinion that it could be challenged, and it would be challenged.
But at this stage, you don't even know what it is that the court's going to be looking at because you haven't had it interpreted by the commission yet. It's a complete open book. Why don't you decide what it is that you want the statute to actually say and put that in place, and then if it runs into constitutional
I'll have
trouble...
to leave it there, Senator Frum.
Mr. Cameron, you got cut off at the beginning when you were about to suggest an amendment, and I just want to invite you to finish that thought. And Mr. Party, also you said you had the suggestion for your amendment in your written submission, which I don't have, so I'm just wondering if you could also explain it again. So I want to get each of you a chance to make your proposal.
So I'll use Professor Peterson as an example in regard to the amendment. He's an academic. He wants to write from an academic perspective in regard to this issue. He wants to consider it from a scientific and sociological and psychological perspective, and he wants to add to what really is a fledgling body of work at this point in time in regard to scientific literature on this particular issue. And it's one that, let's face it, let's not ignore the reality. There's a lot of disagreement over gender identity in the scientific community. So in order to protect people like Professor Peterson, who, from my perspective, have a right to study and then write about their findings without fear of running afoul of Section 319 of the Criminal Code, what should be done is an amendment should be drafted that says that the failure, for ease of clarity, the failure or disinclination to use gender-neutral pronouns or gender identifiers shall in no way be construed to contravene this statute, either in regard to the criminal context or the Human Rights Code. And I think Professor Purdy and myself more or less agree on that point, that that would be something that would go a long ways to show what the government is trying to do and show that they care about the rights of Canadians who have a right to have an opinion on this issue and express it.
Thank you for the question. I will just read it to you very quickly because it's very short. The following section, this is to be added to the bill. The following section is added to the Canadian Human Rights Act. 3.1a. Nothing in this act shall require any person to use particular words or phrases to refer to any other person. B. For greater certainty, but not so as to affect the generality of subsection A, the use of male and female pronouns to refer to any person does not constitute a discriminatory practice.
Okay, but that, if you took that last phrase, that does in fact conflict with gender expression.
No.
The inclusion of the term gender expression in this bill is precisely so that people can compel people to use pronouns that do not conform to male or female.
Well, but this is the question, though, right? I mean, if gender expression is to mean that you must use certain pronouns, then we do have forced speech. That's the question. That is not the only possible interpretation of gender expression. What it also could mean is people are free to express their gender in the way they see fit, and they're not allowed to be denied a job for that reason. That would be the meaning that I would expect would be standard, and most like the effect of the other kinds of grounds that are now in the Act.
Thank you.
Okay. Senator Dupuy.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Mr. Party, I have a question for you. A main question and then a secondary one. So the main question is this. In your proposed amendment, which I see on page 7 of your presentation, have you considered the possibility that by including this type of amendment, we might diminish the current theory that says that the rights recognized in the Charter are all equal and that no right takes precedence over another and no one takes precedence. So by introducing this sort of amendment, wouldn't we attract attention to one prohibited grounds of discrimination? So wouldn't we be, in a sense, diminishing the status of some of the other grounds?
No, I don't think so. I think that's because this is a ground that has this difference. It is the only one really that raises this question of language. And the irony here is that when it comes to forced speech, we are in a situation where this ground and the people within this group, if you can call it a group, will end up with more rights than anybody else because they are the only people who are entitled to require people to change their speech. I can't imagine any of the other grounds having that effect. If you are looking at this discrimination on the basis of sex or age, I mean, there's no language question in there. And as my friend Mr. Cameron has suggested, there isn't anybody else in society who has the ability to demand being addressed by a certain word. If you were to address me by a word that I don't like, that's too bad. The one exception will be this ground and this group.
Je veux juste vous référer à l'autre argument qui...
I just want to refer to the other argument that was raised today, and that's about protecting the rights of women. When it comes to women, there are still a lot of people of the masculine sex in Canada who think that they can call women any name they want. But in this case, the reason we decided to forbid discrimination based on sex and also harassment is that people thought that they could use any word, any name that they wanted. But that doesn't mean that people no longer have the right to speak in Canada. But there is still a prohibition on using specific terms that goes so far beyond the limit. So here, are we not kind of short-circuiting the equality of the protections that are granted under different grounds?
I don't think so. I think the key word in your question was prohibition. When it comes to discrimination that might be reflected in language, you're suggesting that there might be prohibition on referring to people in a certain way. Maybe that is so, but it is still a prohibition, not a requirement. In this case, we're talking about being required to take a certain pronoun identified by a certain person, and that person saying, you will use this particular word to refer to me, or I will report you to the Human Rights Commission. That does not happen with any other ground in the Act.
Est-ce que je
No,
peux
I'm
rapidement-
sorry.
No,
Have to
okay.
be in second round. Senator Batters.
Thanks very much. Thank you, all of you, for being here. And if I can address this to one of the women from the Quebec Women's Rights Association, could you please tell us what you think the impact of this particular bill could be on safe spaces for women?
La reconnaissance de...
The recognition of gender identity would allow a man who feels like a woman to enter into spaces that were reserved for women. Women have put a lot of time into gaining these protections, not only based on gender, but also based on sex. In the discussion on this subject, there's a lot of confusion between the two terms, particularly in English, when often the word gender is used instead of the word sex. In French, we use the terms differently, and we have used the terms as the Government of Canada officially uses them, and in the same way that all the other organizations that deal with gender equality use them. So there are rights that are based on women's sex, not on their gender. Just because women wear shoes or dress in such and such a way, or conform to various stereotypes, that's not why they need separate safe spaces. They need those safe spaces for their protection. We presented statistics about violence against women, and this violence, mainly perpetrated by men, exists. And there are protections given to women who are the main victims of this male violence. The Chief of Statistics Canada has confirmed that violence against women is very much alive in Canada, and so women have very specific and real reasons to be concerned about their safety. The Government of Canada recently, through the Minister for the Status of Women, has committed to preventing violence against women, and they did so before the UN in March. So when the concept of gender identity, which is not well defined, which is very subjective, and which is non-verifiable, well, as soon as we start dealing with that, it means that any man can claim a female identity in order to enter into safe spaces reserved for women. So if we recognize gender identity as being equivalent to sex identity, then we have essentially gotten rid of protections that exist for women based on sex. And we gave two examples. We talked about sports and we talked about prisons, where physical differences are clear if you look at sports. Even if Serena Williams is a great tennis champion, she's the best, she herself says that she wouldn't be able to beat the 100 top male tennis players. So it's clear that differences based on biological sex are important, and denying those differences means denying women's rights. We have a government that has committed since 1982, since it signed an agreement about ending discrimination against women, it has pursued that fight, and it has fought for gender equality. And women's equality means protecting spaces for women. It means protecting programs like programs that ensure access to positions of power. There are various programs that exist in provinces to protect women's right to positions of power. There are also rights concerning change rooms, safe spaces. And then also when you talk about prisons, there's an issue too. Because male inmates, who have been found guilty of sexual violence against women and have been imprisoned for that, can claim a different gender identity and request a transfer into a women's prison. There's nothing preventing that. In Great Britain, where a bill similar to C-16 was studied, that is exactly what the Association for Gender Specialists said after having studied the requests of inmates asking to be transferred to women's prisons. They have nothing to lose. If they're in prison for 25, 30 years, there's nothing stopping those inmates who have been found guilty of violence to request a transfer. And then, of course, it's the women in prisons who are being endangered. So this concerns us. We're concerned to see that the question of women.
Very brief final question from Senator Gold.
Just a little follow-up for the last question there. Now, I certainly understand and respect your concerns, but are your concerns about eliminating protections for transgender, or are you saying that there may be contexts in which so-called discrimination might be reasonable given the need to protect women or for other reasons? In 2013, the president of the Canadian Human Rights Commission said that transgender rights were already protected under the Charter, and that the Commission was already receiving and processing complaints, discrimination complaints, against transgendered people. So we completely agree with that. We think that we should protect people who don't conform to gender types, or don't, those people shouldn't lose their job because of that. They shouldn't be discriminated against. Where we have concerns is we're wondering, should there not be some limits? And if there are protections based on biological sex, then does gender identity automatically become synonymous with a sex change? Now, you can change your gender. That's clear. Many people do it. But changing your sex is not really biologically possible. So being a woman biologically comes with some dangers, and it's important to respect those protections. And when the bill was passed by the House of Commons, asked to have a gender-based analysis done on this bill. That was a commitment of the federal government. They said that before they would pass a bill, they would study it to make sure that it would not affect women's rights and would actually hopefully promote women's rights. So our main concern is that this gender-based analysis, as called for by the Auditor General in 2016, would be done, and that we would be able to then judge where there might be differences in the application to ensure that women's rights safety is protected.
Thank you. Witnesses, thank you all for being here today and assisting the committee in its consideration of C-16. Much appreciated. That concludes the meeting for today. Meeting